We'll start now with the invited session, and perhaps I start asking Matthew Glachant to come, and I don't know whether, Matthew, you want to talk from here? Okay, perfect. So you have the profiles of the short CVs of all invited and keynotes and policy session participants in the website. Matthew Glachant is well known to all of you. He's a key researcher in this area for many years. He has done very big contributions, and he's at CERNA and professor of economics at Mines Paris. So we are tight on time, Matthew. I know that you are responsible, but please.
Give me a 5 minutes time.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation and for the great conference. And yes, I'm very sad that it will be the last time that we see here, but we will meet elsewhere, I'm sure. So it's a paper joint work with Guillaume Wald. So Guillaume is here in the room. He will present a paper tomorrow, I think. So he's a great PhD student and so key contributor to this work. So the paper is about a particular type of instruments, which is called energy efficiency obligations, and we will focus on the French program. So I will be quick on motivation. So energy efficiency in France and I think elsewhere at the moment is viewed as an emergency. Here, you know, in bold character here is the quote of what was said at this Toulouse conference, where some of you were, for instance, Matti, 2 weeks ago, and the chief economist of EDF was saying that let's start with energy demand. And the French government agree, because to meet their 2030 targets, so, the minus 55% reduction by 2030, their projections is that 3/4 of the investments to be made, so until 2030, should be in this sector. And so the key instruments in France to achieve this is this instrument. So in fact, it is a widespread instrument, not so well known, despite its importance, because you know there are 16 member states, for instance, in Europe, which rely on these instruments, 24 states in the US, etc., China, and so we will focus on the largest program in Europe, the French one, the Certificat d'économie de l'énergie. So I will call it C2E in the following. 4 billion euros of subsidies. And the key tool to achieve targets set in a very important directive in Europe, the Energy Efficiency Directive. So I will just briefly explain how it works. So every 4 years, the government assign to energy retailers individual energy saving targets, in proportion of their sales. And so these targets are really a set amount of energy savings. Then these energy retailers, so-called obligated parties, they distribute subsidies to energy users, and the vast majority is in the residential sector. So either directly or through intermediaries, and so there is an ecosystem between obligated parties and the ultimate investors, so the households, with many firms trying to find where are the least cost investments. And for each subsidized investment, they receive certificates, and certificates are supposed to reflect the savings achieved by the investments. And these certificates are used to justify compliance. And what is very important for us is that the certificates are tradable. So it means that, you know, a lot of flexibility. You can produce your certificates, you can outsource the production of your certificates to these intermediaries, or you can purchase certificates. So what we do in this paper is to address, to deal with two questions. The first is the energy impact of the program. And so here, the indicator is this amount of projected savings, which are directly related to the certificates. So the question is, what is the impact of 1 kilowatt hour of projected savings on residential gas and electricity use? And this is a way to see whether we comply with the EU targets. And second, cost efficiency, what is the CO2 marginal cost? And the approach is quite straightforward. It's a two-way fixed effects models with an instrumental variables, relying on municipality level data occurring about more than 5 million French people. In France, we have many municipalities, which is, from an institutional point of view, a weakness for sure. But it's good news for econometricians. And so we have information on the individual retrofits made in these municipalities, on the residential electricity and gas consumptions at the municipality level, and various factors influencing energy use. Of course, weather, so degree days, precipitations, income, population. The problem is that we do not have data on other energy sources other than gas and electricity. We do not have information on fuel oil, consumption of fuel oil, and district heating. That's why we restricted the samples to, in fact, 5,000 municipalities, excluding municipalities with district heating, etc. So we do not cover the entire universe of the municipalities. So I will be very quick. Here are the descriptive statistics. What is important is that, in fact, in practice, in the field, what is made is essentially insulation. So, here you have the shares of different investment categories, and you can see that I think that more than around 80% of these investments are, in fact, roof, floor, wall insulation. A heat pump, for instance, is only 8%. So the strategy simple. So the dependent variable, the outcome variable is YIT is the residential energy use in municipality I in year T. The variable of interest is, of course, this projected annual savings, XIT, and we have controls. So, of course, these fixed effects, time and municipality fixed effects. And in addition to this, cooling degree days, heating degree days, precipitations, population, income. I will not explain what are cooling degree days and energy and heating degree days, because I assume that you more or less know what it is. It's basically a matrix used by engineers to measure the energy needs, heating-related energy needs. The problem is that we have a problem of self-selection. I mean, the investors, so the households, they decide to be treated because they decide to invest. And I will give two examples of the type of problem that the type of problems that it raises. There is something that I call the Greta Thunberg effect. So the Greta Thunberg is the idea that, so it's a shock on green preferences, a local shock. It's the idea that, suddenly people are more environmentally aware, so they know that there are fossil fuels behind electricity and gas. So it leads them to first increase their propensity to invest. So influences X, but it also leads them to directly reducing their potentially the indoor temperature because they want to save energy, and so in this way you have the problem. It leads to basically to overestimate the effect of these investments. So Greta Thunberg, because the idea is that this shock is produced by Greta Thunberg coming to this city and giving a conference and creating this shock. Another problem that is very serious from an economic point of view is that, and it is a standard problem, in fact, which is not addressed in most of the papers that I know, most of the econometric papers that I know in this field, I mean, is the fact that you have investments subsidized by the program, but you have also investments conducted without any support from the program, so non-C2E investments. And as you will see, we need to address this. So the instrument, the intuition is quite simple. So what we use is the past values of the HDD and CDD. So the precise specification is to simply add the two. So a 2-year lag. So the idea is that it takes time to take the decision to invest. So 2 years ago, the winter months were very cold. So it means that it increases it increased the salience of energy efficiency related characteristic of your house, and so you decide to invest in energy efficiency, and so that's why the instrument is relevant. It's a predictor of the amount of investments made, and it would be exogenous if it has no impact on energy use 2 years later, okay? So, because we are T-2. And so if this is credible when you think of traditional omitted variables such as this Greta Thunberg effect, we have a problem here with non-C2E investments. So I will briefly explain what is the problem. So let's denote, so let RIT denotes the volume of this non-C2E investments. And let's rewrite the second stage equation of that we want to estimate. And so we have two variables here reflecting omitted variables, so R and the noise epsilon. We can be confident, I think you believe in the identification assumptions that there is no correlation between epsilon and Y, and X, sorry, because of this instrument. But the problem is that these instruments, past temperature, also the idea is that it increases the propensity to invest, so it increases also the propensity to invest in non-C2E investments. So this is the problem. And here we have not been able to find a very clean solution to this problem. Again, this problem is also present in other papers and sometimes forgotten by these papers, so very frequently ruled out, and this problem leads, in fact, to bias the value of beta, beta to SLS, which is our variable of the coefficients that we want to estimate. We know that but we know the sign. So the good news is that we know the sign, and we know it because we know that the covariance between Z, so the instruments, so the past HDD, is positively correlated with the investments made, okay? Because this is the same story which explains the relevance of the instruments. And so it leads to give an upper bound. So I will not enter into the details, but it gives an upper bound of the impact of this program. Okay, 5 minutes? Okay, 3. Okay, so results. So the beta, so what is important is the 2 SLS fixed effect results. So the beta 0.377. So it means that for 1 kilowatt hour projected by the program, we only end up with 0.4 kilowatt hour. So it means that we have a 60% performance gap, which is very wide. Yes. It's mostly due. What is achieved is mostly due to gas, but I go very quickly. And what is important is to see what is the reason behind this very wide gap. And I think that's, my interpretation is how the program works. I mean, these programs gives a lot of flexibility between to the obligated parties and various firms to find the least cost investments. And the easiest way to find a least cost investments is to find poor quality investments, because when the quality is very low, the production cost is low, okay? And as the buyers of these investments, of these energy efficiency services are not able, there is this information asymmetry issue, they are not able to observe the quality, or they are uncertain, it leads to this, problem. So it means that the problem, in fact, exacerbates something that we know, which is this information asymmetry problem on the energy efficiency markets. And I finish with the marginal CO2 abatement cost. What is unique in this paper is the fact that we have access to the certificate price. And the certificate price, given that you have competition, a market, etc., is supposed to reflect the cost of producing a certificate, and so the cost of inducing an investment, and so all the cost behind this, including transaction costs, all these commercialization efforts, the non-monetary costs, comfort benefits for the investors, or also a non-monetary cost, the fact that, to have people in your house during 2 months is a cost, in addition to the monetary expenditures for these investments. And so we end up with this level, so 320 euros per ton, which is quite high, and so although the program was designed to be cost effective, it is not in practice, and so that's the end of the story. And I think I'm in time, no? On time. Thank you.
Okay, we are rather tight with time, but we have some minutes for questions to Matthew. We can also save this time and continue with other presentations and have more time at the end. But I would like to give the opportunity of people asking, and perhaps you can introduce yourself.
Thank you, Xavier. Very quickly, I'm Ibon Galarraga from the Basque Center for Climate Change. My question is, might be part of this be explained because of behavioral factors? Because this is the part perhaps that I miss in this analysis, that the gap between engineering calculations and real savings might be due to that.
Yeah, I know. So just a reaction on that. So there's a lot of debate about this rebound effect. Okay. And I think that we tend to overestimate the size of this rebound effect. So I'm not sure that this is the main reason why you have a gap between the predictions and the reality. And so I can cite these papers, these by Foley, Greenstone, et al., what they have done is to simply measure the ex ante and ex post the indoor temperature in retrofitted homes. And their result is that, the increase is very small. And what they say, it's more the quality of the investments made, plus simply mistakes in these engineering models. So that's their results. And
more questions, comments? Yeah, Matti.
Thank you. Well, Ken is installing. Maybe I can ask a technical question about this, because the result depends quite a bit of this. My name is Matti Liski, and the result depends quite a bit on how much of this effect you attribute to these installations in the program and those that you don't observe. Mm-hmm. So, and then it kind of reminds me that the method by Emily Oster, where you are looking, if you have an observable sort of these omitted factors, you look for how much of the R variation they could explain, and how much if you really maximize that, then you would get the R square to 1, and that would give you the sort of the the most conservative estimate for the impacted units. And did you consider that?
So not yet. In fact, it's a work on progress.
Yeah.
So I take the comment. We have carried out a series of robustness checks already, but not this one. So so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Perhaps if we have time later at the end of the session, we can have more discussions. And now we have Ken Gillingham from Yale University, professor there of economics, and you participated in Atosha some years ago. So thank you for coming. And I think you are finishing your stay in Europe now, right?
That's right.
And,
just a few more weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the organizers for hosting us in this lovely location, and thanks to all. It's so great to see so many of you. Many of you I have not seen for quite some time. So for those of you I don't know, I'm Ken Gillingham from Yale University, visiting ETH Zurich right now for a few more weeks. And this is work with Brian Bollinger at NYU Stern, Todd Gerarden at Cornell, Daniel Zhu at Duke and NBR, and Drew Vollmer, who was previously Daniel and Brian's PhD student, is now at the Department of Justice. And we're looking at the welfare impacts of U.S. solar panel tariffs. The big picture here is that protectionism is back in vogue, and there have been quite a few trade restrictions over the past decade. And solar markets are a particularly interesting one to study. There are very few panels produced domestically in the United States. And there is the ability under several of the tariffs for foreign manufacturers to partly avoid those tariffs. And the big picture here is that there's a real tension between decarbonization and industrial policy or deglobalization. So the paper is very much about these tariffs. Did the set of tariffs, which I'm about to describe, cause trade diversion, meaning that you had a set of plants, and some of the plants were now sending the plants that are outside of the trade-restricted location would send their panels to the United States, and the other plants would not, or trade destruction, or what combination of both. And then what are the welfare effects of those, and compare that to the welfare effects of subsidies. So the bigger picture empirical approach is we're going to document how firms' production activity responded to tariffs. Did they move? Did they produce less? And estimate a model of competition among manufacturers where we have demand for solar panels in both the utility and residential markets in the United States, and supply of manufacturers who source panels, and then do some counterfactuals. So I'm going to go very quickly through much of the actual model, but I'm going to give a preview of results right now to give you the big picture. We're going to first present some descriptive, some evidence, I'm going to call it suggestive evidence, that foreign firms relocated production to avoid tariffs, or descriptive evidence. Then I'm going to give you the high-level view of the model, which ends up showing that tariffs both diverted trade and destroyed trade. And then look at the question, how did U.S. import tariffs affect the domestic solar market? So there's going to be a small increase. So if you zone out for the rest of the presentation, here are the key results. A small increase in domestic production, a shift in production from China to Southeast Asia, a large reduction in welfare compared to no intervention. The tariffs did reduce welfare. And actually a decrease in domestic employment. Now this sounds surprising, but there's such a small domestic market for manufacturing, and yet there's a large domestic market for installing. Installing is a very labor-intensive activity, going up on the roof and actually putting them up. And so if you have fewer solar panels actually being installed in the US, you end up losing domestic employment. And then, not too surprisingly, a 30% subsidy to domestic manufacturing ends up doing much better than the tariffs. I'm going to go very quickly. There's a large literature on the incidence of tariffs, and a paper, Flan et al., that's very related that's on washing machines and talks about some strategic avoidance there. And our paper has a lot of echoes of that. And then there's a large and growing solar panel literature that I should mention very briefly. Some background before I get into the model. Manufacturers use polysilicon, so the vast majority of the market are polycrystalline silicon. and solar panels, and they use polysilicon to make solar panels, the modules at the end. But they go from polysilicon, they create the wafers, they go to cells, they go to modules, and then you have the whole system that's put together at the end. And there could be trade restrictions at any level of these. China dominates the global production of solar panels, still does. More than half of the US imports in the early 2010s came from China. And there were 4 rounds of US solar tariffs that we're going to be analyzing in this paper. I could talk later about, or over the coffee break, about what's going on right now, today. There was one in 2012, an anti-dumping countervailing duty, where these duties are assigned at the firm country level and are focused just on Chinese solar cells, 31% plus tariffs. And then in 2014, all cells and panels from China and Taiwan, due to complaints that Chinese firms just started shipping from their Taiwanese manufacturing plants. And then Section 201 in 2018 included almost all imports, starting at 30% and then decreasing. But there's a certain amount, there's an exclusion. So the first 2.5 gigawatts of imported cells are excluded. Note that it's cells. That led to a little bit more manufacturing in the modules, because the modules take in the cells in the United States. And then in 2018, there was an additional 25% tariff for Chinese products. So kind of a sequential increasing and ramping up of tariffs. We bring together data from 2010 to 2020. The core of the data set is from IHS Markit, which has quarterly records of production by firm and country and quarterly records of total shipments to the US for the largest firms. So we have the 20 top firms in the world and have both shipments, both imports and domestic shipments. One of the challenges is we don't observe the origin of the shipments directly. We have to infer this. And then we have US government data on tariff duties, duties paid, and import flows to allow us to check our model, which has actually been really useful. Some first descriptives. Those blue dotted lines show the 4 different tariff policies that I had mentioned. And what we see is kind of the share of Chinese firms' capacity that's offshore, meaning outside of China, started relatively low, around 5%, and dramatically increased between after 2014 and raised up to about 20%. Of course, did U.S. tariffs cause Chinese firms to offshore production? We're not going to be pushing this too hard, but we're going to estimate a quick event study to provide some I'm going to call this more descriptive evidence. We look at comparing Chinese firms to other Chinese firms that were subject to much higher rates. So we have some firms that are listed in the Federal Register and some firms that are not. And the control firms don't actually export to the US at all. So there are some Chinese firms that just don't export to the US. So we can compare those firms to each other. And we see the effect, this is mostly descriptive, but it's an event study, looking at the capacity outside of China to Chinese firms affected by tariffs relative to the Chinese firms that just weren't sending to the US at all. And we see just kind of a steady increase there, matching the descriptive that I showed before. And something very similar when we look at in terms of megawatts. This is the production outside of China. So there's kind of a evidence here of some strategic avoidance, basically shifting more production outside of China. Interestingly, one raises the question, well, did it spur much production in the US? So the 2018 Trump administration tariffs appear to have spurred some domestic assembly. Note that a lot of these tariffs were on the cells. So the cells then are put together into the modules. And what you see there is that module production did increase. So there were a set of factories that opened in Buffalo, US, in the Phoenix area, and several others, Georgia, that increased their module production. Cell and wafer production still stayed almost entirely outside of the United States. So to analyze this in a deeper way, we model supply and demand to understand the economic effects. We're studying an upstream market. We have this commoditized product, limited price dispersion, very limited response, and I didn't show this, but we look at the response to firm-specific prices, in firm-specific prices to firm-specific tariffs. Basically, is there a price response or is there a quantity response? And it appears that there's very little response when you put in firm-specific tariffs, because a lot of these tariffs were specific to particular firms. Some firms had higher tariffs than other firms based on how much of their production was in different countries. And there was very little response in the pricing. And it's probably because it's such a competitive market in many ways. But there was a really notable response in firm-specific quantities. And it does appear that these firms were responding in terms of changing their quantity. All of these things suggest core-node competition. So we're modeling it as a core-node game. We have the demand. We have about 65% of the market are large-scale utility systems, and about 35% of the market are small-scale systems. So it's really important that we model both. The results I'm going to show are a classic trade-style constant elasticity of aggregate demand equation. But we also do a more I/O industrial organization style estimate of utility scale and residential solar using all the data from the US. Remarkably, they come up quite similar, which was really nice for us. So I'll show you the results from the first one with the classic trade style constant elasticity demand equation. We model entry. We allow firms are exogenously chosen their home location, and the entry of major players preceded the tariffs. So basically, whether the players were in was already there, but we model the investment decision. And we're looking at this forward-looking decision about whether to offshore production while playing a static core-node game. So each period, manufacturers choose quantities to maximize their profits. CFT is the cost of paying the tariffs. And under the assumption of constant marginal costs, you can invert the first order condition and look at the market shares and the price elasticity of demand in time t. So we allow each firm to choose its lowest cost location. So think about it this way. The firms are producing in China. They're facing higher tariffs if they export from China than if they export from Taiwan or if they export from, say, Vietnam. And we allow the firms to be switching. But of course, they may have different productivity in the different locations as well. So we're modeling the different productivity in those different locations. And that's the basic idea. We're looking at modeling the potential post-tariff unit production costs in each location, which depends on wages, tariff rates, productivity shock. And so we're using a classic Eaton and Kortum approach where you assume an IID-Frachet distribution. This is their 2002 paper. For those of you familiar with the trade literature, this is pretty standard. And we operationalize this via an equation that I'm skipping for time. And I want to get straight to the results. So one key result is you definitely see if you increase the wholesale price, you decrease quantity. This is trade being destroyed. That's kind of a result right there. It's a little different. It's pretty robust. Note the number of observations isn't that much because this is the equation that's using the constant elasticity approach. When we do it using all the data, because we have the data for all of the utility scale and all of the residential scale solar, we get very, very similar results. This is a little bit of an easier approach and quicker approach for running counterfactuals, so we opt for this, but the results turn out to be the same using individual level data as well. When you look at it, the wholesale price pre-tariffs and post-tariffs, it's not that different. Those are barely statistically different from each other, maybe a little less elastic afterwards, post-tariffs. But kind of a key takeaway is, look, some trade is destroyed. We can look at the country-specific productivity in each of the countries. So we look at the cost relative to the United States, excluding the tariffs. So this is like the underlying costs. And these underlying costs are relatively constant over time. So China's costs have kind of creeped up a little bit, which is consistent with wages getting higher in China over this time period, which is actually what has been going on. Other countries kind of flat. Now, of course, the composition of those countries has changed a little bit. And this is all relative to the United States. So it is true that the costs are lower elsewhere. That's kind of a key result. When you bring in the tariffs, so now the tariffs are incorporated in this, you can look at how the Chinese costs really start going up. Because these tariffs raised the costs pretty substantially. And so you see the light red ones all kind of jumping up, and actually some of them were jumping up above the USA blue line in there due to the tariffs. And so this is something that comes out of actually modeling the productivity. So in my remaining time, I'm going to talk about the counterfactual. We solve the model for market equilibrium with different tariffs and subsidies and quantify these impacts. And then we do a back-of-the-envelope calculation of the impacts of pollution based on a nice paper in Jerry by Sexton et al. Note that the production relocation that we're talking about, or reallocation, comes about through both intensive and extensive margins, where the intensive margin is you have a plant and you can ramp up how much production is in that plant and how much is sent to the US. An extensive margin is actually building new plants, right? And we do a bounding exercise for the extensive margin. And I mentioned the two different counterfactuals that we're going to run to look at these productivity differences. How am I doing on time?
1 minute.
1 minute?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm almost done. The tariffs significantly reduced the share of panels from China. They increased the share of panels from the US. They increased the share of panels from other countries due to offshoring. But the welfare effects, as I mentioned before, are negative, quite negative. There's a loss in consumer surplus from trade being destroyed. There is a loss in producer surplus, a slight gain in producer surplus in the US, larger loss in producer surplus overall. There is some improvement in government revenue. So the tariffs bring in government revenue. They also mean that you've destroyed some of the trade, so you put in fewer solar panels, and thus you pay out fewer subsidies. That's the other piece to it. And then obviously from the environmental perspective, this is a negative thing. Wages and employment are negatively affected due to the installer side. We also look at a subsidy. Subsidy does much better on all the fronts. So I'm going to finish here, and the point is that while there are geopolitical reasons why they put in these tariffs, they do have a negative welfare effect, which we quantify. They also have this negative domestic employment effect, which raises lots of questions about the choice of tariffs versus domestic subsidies.
Thank you. Very nice presentation, very timely. I'm sure that tomorrow in the policy discussion this will be raised, and it is timely also with the tariffs on electric vehicles in Europe, for instance, and I'm sure that we'll have different viewpoints tomorrow. We have time for some questions, comments. Anyone wants to? Yeah.
Hi, Lisa Ryan from UCD. Thanks, Ken, for a very nice presentation. I just wonder if you looked at the long-term welfare effects, would they come out a little bit differently, like as production becomes more established? I don't know, would they look any different? And the other thing is, I suppose, what hasn't been considered is the optimal installation rate anyway of solar panels. Maybe now, if they're more expensive, they only get installed in places with a higher irradiation, which probably should only, I suppose there's a broader kind of picture that could be also estimated in terms of those full welfare effects, and whether you considered them for the future.
Yeah, great question. So on the second part, I'm going to punt on that. We're not looking at this being optimal. We're purely looking at a policymaker who wants to get more solar panels out there. So we're not trying to do that. There are a variety of other excellent papers that do look at questions like that. Duena has a paper, and others have papers looking at this. But on the first question on the long-run impacts, we talk about it in the paper, and the real key question is, how much are you going to actually onshore domestic production? And we do see some jump in module production, but we see nothing on cells and wafers. There's a little bit of emphasis, like stepping back, we did this analysis out to 2020, but stepping back, there's a little bit we've seen on cells in the US, but still there's very, very, very little in cells. And so it's pretty hard to see these results tipping too far unless there's just a massive change in the industrial organization of the sector and so the way the supply chain is set up. And so that's sort of our take on it right now. That would not say that it's not impossible. If you combine subsidies with tariffs, could you eventually build domestic manufacturing? But the cost differential is pretty huge once you get to the wafer, especially when you get at the wafer level.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for the nice presentation. I just have a follow-up question, I think. If we talk about these energy security aspects, these things, I mean, you talked now about having more domestic production. I mean, that's one part, but also you showed that there is a relocation of production to other places, and that's, of course, another thing, you get more diversification, which might be good as well, if you want to prevent this type of dependency on specific suppliers. Have you looked into this on the security side?
Great question. So there are kind of two components. One is some of the early subsidies really only targeted China, and they led to much of the offshoring from China to other countries by Chinese multinationals, primarily by Chinese multinationals, some degrees by South Koreans, but primarily Chinese multinationals. But more recent, the later rounds of tariffs were on everyone. They're still higher on the Chinese firms, but they were on everyone. So if you put it on everyone, it actually, if anything, led back to some of the production to go back to China again, because they had the cost advantage over other places. So it's actually really complicated how you design a tariff scheme if you have these objectives of kind of creating diversification. And if you target one country, that's particularly difficult in WTO negotiations and a variety of other negotiations. So there are a variety of trade-offs from a policy perspective. It's a great question. Probably out of time.
Thank you. I think we need to continue.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So while Simon prepares his presentation, we'll have all the presentations, if authors agree, uploaded in the website. Also, you have some technicians recording things, which under also authorization will be available only in plenary session. So Simon, he's professor. He's well known to all of you. This is your first time here, by the way.
Can't believe I haven't been before.
And he's a professor of environmental policy at the London School of Economics. So thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. Is it about 15 minutes?
Yeah, I would say, in 20 minutes in total, to allow for a couple of minutes.
Good, stopwatch. Okay, thanks so much for having me. Thanks everyone for coming. This is joint work with Thomas Sturck, National Bank of Belgium, James Rising at Delaware, Drew Schindel at Duke. And you learn everything you need to know from the title of the paper, so I can probably just sit down at this point. So what's this all about? So methane is a potent, short-lived greenhouse gas. It's contributed about 1/3 of total warming from well-mixed greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. And atmospheric methane concentrations, having plateaued in the early 2000s, are once again increasing rapidly. Consequently, it was argued in the Global Methane Assessment, which is like the IPCC report for methane, that methane abatement is very likely to be the most powerful lever in reducing near-term warming. And in an IMF report, it was, let's say, speculated that it could cut the very scary risks of tipping points. And on the abatement cost side, substantial technical potential has been identified to reduce methane emissions, and a lot of that comes from engineering cost estimates. That was raised earlier. But if we take those engineering cost estimates at face value to begin with, then a lot of methane abatement is argued to be low cost, maybe even negative cost. And policymakers are listening to this. So at COP26 in the world's greatest city in November 2021, the Global Methane Pledge was launched by the US and the European Union, and that is to reduce methane emissions by at least 30% below the 2020 level by 2030. And signatories commit to implementing those reductions in domestic law, and now 156 countries have signed the Global Methane Pledge. Still, there's a degree of debate about the rightful role of methane abatement in climate policy. So for proponents of methane action, they think that climate policy is too fixated on long-term CO2 goals. So the argument here is there's too much focus on end-of-century temperature as the ultimate goal of climate policy, and that temperatures between now and then matter. That there is too much focus on getting state and non-state actors to adopt net zero by 2050 goals and leave it at that. There's been research into the extent to which methane is mentioned and featured in NDCs to the Paris Agreement, and it tends to be very little. And there's a little bit of a row on whether the practice of converting methane into CO2 equivalent using 100-year global warming potentials actually might underestimate the economic impact of methane. And the contrary view is that you can put off methane abatement without compromising long-term CO2 goals. And I think the mental model that people have here who make this kind of argument is that there's like a fixed amount of political attention, and it needs to be directed at CO2. Okay, I think that's the kind of implicit model here. Okay, so in this paper, it's a very simple paper. We just want to know how good are the economics of methane abatement. And we think this question actually hasn't been answered yet. Specifically, we want to do a benefit cost analysis of the global methane pledge and continued methane abatement after 2030 that's consistent with it. The method is we're going to use an integrated assessment model, an IAM. I'm going to use a model that my colleagues and I have built in recent years. It's called META. META being a so-called social cost IAM doesn't do abatement costs. So for the abatement side, we're going to retrieve cost estimates from the global methane assessment. That's the GMA. Okay. So simple approach conceptually. So what have we got in terms of previous literature? Well, there have been some studies looking at the physical effects of methane abatement on things like temperatures, sea levels, and so on. The global methane assessment itself quantified some economic benefits of methane abatement, including, it has to be said, pathways that don't go through avoiding climate change. So an important caveat is that our study just looks at the benefits of methane abatement in terms of avoided climate change, but methane also causes problems with local air pollution in interaction with other gases in the atmosphere. There are several studies quantifying the marginal damage cost of methane, the social cost of methane. There's been a lot of work on that recently in the United States, feeding into the EPA process and the use of social costs in cost-benefit analysis. That literature is primarily concerned with estimating marginal damage costs, whereas our primary concern is going to be total damage costs compared with total costs of abatement. Okay? All of this literature is tiny, right, compared with the literature on CO2. Okay, methods. Basically proceeds in 3 steps. I put the third step in parentheses because it's not as solid. Okay? So the first step is we need to construct a set of emission scenarios which are going to mimic the achievement of the global methane pledge and some kind of coherent pathway for methane emissions beyond 2030. And to do that, we use the IPCC scenario database with some harmonization to make sure that all the scenarios are starting in the same spot, and the ones that implement the methane pledge all do so exactly. We're going to take those scenarios in the second step, we're going to put them through the meta model. That's going to give us the total economic benefits of these scenarios, and then we're going to compare those with cost estimates that we've retrieved from the global methane assessment. That's the third step. That's the step that's not sort of modeled. And so that's why I've put it in parentheses. So the methane scenarios look like this. So you've got the central methane action scenario exactly achieves the global methane pledge and then continues reducing methane to the end of the century. We've bracketed this with low and high scenarios. These reflect differences across integrated assessment models in terms of how much methane action is taken. It, broadly speaking, represents uncertainty across these models about technical methane abatement potential and costs. And then what you can also see here is our preferred baseline. So our preferred baseline methane emissions are quite optimistic, right? So this is SSP2 4.5. This is what we think is the SSP scenario with that most represents current policies and trends. If you don't like that, we run the whole thing as well with SSP 3 7.0. If you're into the SSP world, I've been arguing for some years that we should not be using SSP 5 8.5, so we just don't use that. We superpose these methane scenarios on a set of background scenarios. These background scenarios serve 2 purposes. Firstly, they set baseline methane emissions, and secondly, of course, we've got to model the emissions of the other gases, right? Because the effects of these gases interact, not necessarily in the atmosphere, but in terms of their effect on temperature and damages. So you can't just model methane action in isolation. You've got to also deal with CO2. These go into the meta-model. So the meta-model is an IAM. I've been starting to use the term tentatively social cost IAM to describe a set of models that has emerged in recent years which are primarily intended to estimate the social cost of greenhouse gases. So they're primarily geared towards estimating damages. We originally built Meta to study tipping points and published a paper in 2021 in PNAS on that, but Meta functions like a standard IAM. You can turn the tipping points off. I mean, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But I mean, if you, as a modeler, you can turn them off if you want. So if you're not in the IAM world, it's probably just worth dwelling for a minute on what these social cost IAMs are all about. So this goes back to a report which was published in 2017 by the US National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, which made several recommendations for the improvement of IAMs. And I've picked out 3 here. So the first one is the recommendation that IAMs should become modular, in the sense that scientists from different fields should be building modules that cover their areas of expertise. For example, climate scientists should build climate models, and economists should build the economic parts of these models, and they should be able to be coupled together flexibly in a common scientific computing language, right? So to promote multidisciplinarity, essentially, in a bid to produce models which are overall, in some sense, better or more valid. Second recommendation, which kind of flows from the first one, is basically that IAMs should have sensible climate modules. And I've written a couple of papers on this before, that IAMs in the past have not had climate modules which satisfy well-known diagnostic tests in climate science. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, that IAMs should have damages modules which are able to be calibrated on this explosion of empirical research into climate damages. 11 years ago, Bob Pindyke described the damage functions in IAMs as made up. I find that I've always thought of that as a bit of an exaggeration, but there's also a healthy dose of truth about it. So the idea here is to try to get more serious about calibration. So our model has been built with these in mind. So the climate module comes from climate science, and it has a dedicated methane cycle. And that's not a trivial point. You can't study methane abatement using traditional versions of DICE, right? Because the DICE model does not have methane. The latest one does, but many IAMs, particularly in the kind of macroeconomic tradition, just don't have methane, so they're useless for this task. Secondly, it provides relatively comprehensive benefit and damage estimates. So we've got market and non-market damages and temperature and sea level channels. It estimates damages at the country level for 179 countries. So you can look at the distributional impacts of methane abatement, and it has these tipping point modules. So you can think about that too. We've made a bunch of improvements. You can ignore this slide. If you're interested in IAMs, the model is on GitHub. It's written in the Julia language using the Mimi package. There's a small and growing bunch of people developing it, and we would love it if you would do it too. Okay, so results, because I've only got a few minutes left, right? So how much would implementation of the global methane pledge actually reduce global warming? And the answer is by an expected 0.13 degrees by 2050. Okay? Now, that doesn't sound like much, does it? But actually, we estimate that that would be highly beneficial. Okay? It would reduce total climate damages from 3.5% of GDP to 3.1%, which in absolute money terms would be equivalent to a flow of $1 trillion a year by 2050 in 2020 prices. So when you put that together then with the cost estimates which come from the global methane assessment, you get very high net present value of global methane action. Now, the cost estimates are very optimistic. They come from engineering studies. Even if we take the highest cost estimate, the benefit to cost ratio of methane action is over 3. And these engineering studies would have to underestimate abatement costs by a very large margin until methane action would be NPV 0. In the paper, we compute the switching value of a constant flow of abatement costs. Okay. Do a few. So why are the benefits of methane action so large? Well, one of the things that's going on is that methane action, like CO2 action, is pro-poor. So with a model like META, you can actually look at the distribution of benefits across countries. So we take damages for all 179 countries and group them into the World Bank's country income categories. You can see the data are noisy because country exposure to climate change depends on a lot of stuff, and it would be weird if the relationship were very tight. But nonetheless, the damages are statistically much higher in low and lower middle income countries than in upper middle and high income countries. So the benefits of methane action are accordingly statistically higher in poor countries. And in a model like META, which has implicitly equity weights, that's contributing to the welfare value. Another thing that's contributing to the welfare value for a social planner who is risk averse is that methane action is shifting the distribution of climate damages to the left, okay? And in the table, we compute various measures of climate risk, including value at risk and conditional value at risk, and methane action reduces all of these. We also quantify how much methane action would reduce the risk of tipping points. The tipping points contribute to the economic cost, but some climate scientists don't like money estimates. So we also produce this tipping point index, okay, which essentially says how much less likely are tipping points to happen as a result of methane action. You can see it here for different tipping points. Last thing is we compute the social cost of methane. Our estimate is about $7,300 per ton of methane. That is larger than a lot of previous estimates, controlling for the discount rate and controlling for the climate model. It's not as large as all estimates, but it is large. And you can see the very large right tail of the distribution of the social cost of methane. So yeah, that is it. That's a summary of the paper right here, and I think I'm more or less on time. Thank you.
Questions? Yeah, Mirabel.
Hello, I'm Mirabel Mills from Empirical College. I was wondering if you had a chance to compare this global warming potential debate.
Yes.
So what I understood from listening to scientists is that if we increase from 100 year to 200 year the comparison between methane and CO2, the impact of methane becomes, much less important. And I was wondering how sensitive your results would be to that.
Yeah, so we do this in the paper. I didn't cover this in the talk. So we can compute first of all, we can calculate the ratio of the social cost of methane to the social cost of carbon. And then we can compare that with GWP 100. And actually, it turns out that GWP 100 is a very good proxy for the relative discounted marginal damage cost of methane compared with CO2. In other words, GWP 100, good, okay? So although the paper says methane action is highly beneficial, our analysis also suggests that converting methane into CO2 using GWP 100 is a reasonable proxy for separately modeling out the two gases and computing their marginal social costs. That would be very bad because GWP 100 is a good approximation for the ratio of the marginal damage costs. As economists, we would not want to do GWP conversions. We would think of, to me, the most sensible thing to do is model marginal damage costs, right? Not to convert any gas into CO2, to actually model them separately and work out their marginal costs. But by looking at the ratio of the marginal costs, we can get a sense of how wrong you can go by using global warming potential on any time horizon. And so what I'm saying is that GWP 100 turns out to be quite a good approximation of the ratio of the marginal damage costs. And GWP 20, 50 and 200 are very bad.
Maria and then Matthew.
Well, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. Talking about marginal cost, how do you model, what kind of difference do you include in the marginal cost of methane with respect to CO2?
I'm sorry, could you?
The marginal cost. How do you estimate, or let me put it this way, how do you estimate the damage function of methane with respect to CO2?
So, both gases contribute to warming. And then warming from either gas causes damages through a variety of channels. So each country has a temperature damage function and a sea level rise damage function. And the temperature damage function affects both an aggregate of market impacts, and that's calibrated on macro papers, and an aggregate non-market impact, which is calibrated on the literature on non-market damages.
Yes, it's a bit of a follow-up on that. I'm not a specialist, but I guess that in many cases there are complementarities between abating methane and CO2. For instance, oil extraction, you reduce oil extraction, is good for CO2, is good for... Do you account for this type of complementarities that can also occur in the agricultural sector? Or?
So the short answer is no. So our experiments basically say you can vary methane action while holding CO2 action constant. It's true that some CO2 action would bring about complementary reductions in methane, but the opposite is not necessarily true. So you can reduce methane in oil and gas upstream and midstream. You can reduce methane in agriculture, and you can reduce methane in waste. Those are the three primary mechanisms. They have pretty much nothing to do with CO2. And so that's why we think, that we can vary the methane action scenario while holding CO2 constant.
Thanks so much.
Thank you
so much, Simon. I think this session is great because we have this landscape of so different topics with key researchers. So thanks to all for coming. And now we have not the last presentation. There is another one later in Sato, but we have Antonio Bento from the University of Southern California, and he's from very close to Galicia. We have a very special relationship with the Portuguese. So I'm very glad that we have him here, unfortunately for the first time only.
Yes.
So welcome.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Javier, and thank you to the organizers. It's obviously, as you say, coming from Portugal, this is a big treat. And it's always a good reason to travel from the US to this part of the world. The paper that I'm going to talk about is joint with Claudio Lucinda from University of São Paulo, and Noah Miller, a former student of mine from USC that will be joining the policy school at Carnegie Mellon this fall. And it's really about an attempt to get some empirical traction on this issue that has persisted quite a bit in the public finance and in the political economy literature related to the persistence of inefficient policies. Now, the interesting thing when we think about inefficiency policies is the idea that often new governments come into power and don't have the ability to phase out policies that previous administrations had put in place that for the most part were inefficient. Perhaps of interest to us, one example of such policies are a variety of fuel and other energy subsidies that despite the pressure of international organizations like the IMF, the reality is that they continue to be in place. And again, the likelihood that they will be phased out is yet to be seen. When we look at the theoretical literature in public economics and in political economy, if we go back to the work of Besley and Coate, and more recently the work of Acemoglu, there's basically a series of theoretical explanations for this persistence of inefficiency policies that have to do either with interest groups and lobbies, of course, the protection of industry, and more recent theories of Acemoglu that argue that this is actually a broader problem of inefficient institutions that once put in place in part because of inertia, they are unlikely to change. And so I want to contribute to this literature, of course, adding also to a body of literature that comes from environmental economics that perhaps suggests that maybe some of these inefficient policies persist in part because of distributional constraints or the idea of protecting certain industries as we move towards decarbonization. But as you can imagine, unless we really figure out a way to phase out these inefficient subsidies, this could actually be trouble for climate policy to the extent that it would delay the decarbonization of the sector that has these subsidies and overall would increase the costs of decarbonization. And so the setting that I am going to use to get some anecdotal empirical evidence on this business of persistency comes from an application from Brazil where for a very long time a price freeze on wholesale gasoline has been put in place. In fact, this price freeze started with the first administration of then President Lula and has persisted till now, even during the time when President Bolsonaro was in place. Now, throughout several points in time, there has been an attempt to phase out, and every time that comes up for discussion, it quickly gets shut down, right? And so what I'm going to actually do is, in the context of an event study, I'm going to take advantage of an unexpected announcement to eliminate this price freeze, to learn a little bit about the welfare effects of price freezes, their distributional impacts, and then get a little bit at the political economy determinants of potential persistence of these freezes. Now, where I think I'm going to add to the theoretical literature is through this empirical application, I'm actually going to put forward three plausible reasons for the persistence that actually I think complement a lot the theoretical literature and in a lot of respects are quite intuitive. As you will see, I think I'm going to provide quite convincing evidence that this inefficient policy is going to persist in part because it's quite simple. So when you announce a price freeze, in principle, it's a policy that goes somewhat under the radar. It applies to everybody in the economy and doesn't seem to bother a lot of people. And in principle, economic agents are actually pleased about it. But perhaps the two reasons that are particularly interesting here is the fact that when you do a price freeze as a government, but you rely on an oil firm that you implicitly control the board, the policy may actually at first glance appear to be free to the general population. And this is in part because you're really passing the burden that otherwise would have fallen in the form of quite salient higher taxes through this back channel that affects the depreciation of stock values to shareholders of these firms. Now, another aspect of this persistence may actually have to do with the fact that these price freezes are often motivated by the idea of controlling inflation expectations, as well as solving credit constraints to lower-income individuals that would be affected by higher prices. And so, to a certain extent, this is a non-salient progressive policy because the price freeze effectively redistributes money to the poor in this very subtle way where you don't have to actually have a formal discussion about redistribution, right? So what I'm going to do to convince you of these ideas is the paper has really three big parts. The first part is the econometrics, where we are going to do an event study and measure the costs of maintaining the policy, taking advantage of the announcement and looking at the causal effects of the announcement of abnormal returns. And the methodological contribution here is really to compare traditional finance models with data-driven models by constructing synthetic controls and using a variety of machine learning methods. And what we will see is that the event study will provide a sufficient statistic that then will be used to measure the welfare effects of the price freeze. Then in the second part, I'm going to take this econometric estimate and I'm going to incorporate in a welfare model of a benevolent agent to actually convince you that from a cost-effective point of view, it would have been possible to actually design alternative instruments that would have been a lot more cost-effective. And from a perspective of distributional impacts, you could actually create a coalition that would support the policy reform. And this is really where the puzzle then comes in the third part, where there has to be some kind of behavioral failure or some failure in the system that, despite the fact that in principle you could get all agents in the economy on board for the policy reform will never take place. So that's the plan. Let me tell you very briefly about how the price freeze works in Brazil. So basically the price freeze, starting with the Lula administration, literally freezes the price where, as you can see, international, there's quite a lot of variation in the international price. During the Lula administration, this obviously was not a problem because the price freeze has one particularly interesting feature, which is at times serves as a subsidy, in other times it serves as a tax. So when you look at the cumulative effect during the Lula administration, it kind of cancels it out because sometimes it is above, sometimes the international price is below. When Dilma comes into power, of course, a lot of pressure was starting to put on the government to actually phase out the price freeze because, as you can see, the price freeze is always below the international price, and therefore, in order for the price freeze to be in place, Petrobras, which was the state-controlled major oil company in Brazil, started having massive losses. And so the board of the company set up a meeting, and in October 2013, in revolt to the president, announces that they are ready to phase out this price freeze and, in fact, align wholesale gasoline prices to the international market. Of course, the president at the time was very close to be up for re-election. She was quite upset with this. And so, because there was quite a lot of control of the board, she again twisted the arms of the board. And just a month later, after the initial announcement comes into place, a new announcement of Petrobras comes saying, well, after all, we are not going to do this, and this will be revisited months after. So what we are going to do really is to take advantage of this announcement that happened at a time where the stock market had already been closed, to actually look at how does this announcement capitalizes on stocks when the market reopens the following Monday. And then actually we have the reverse event later on when essentially they back out. Now, when we look at stocks, what we are going to do is we have stocks from Petrobras that are traded in the Brazilian market as well as in the New York market, and we are also going to collect all peer firms, which are oil firms from around the world, as well as all the large Brazilian firms that are traded both in Brazil, stock market, as well as in New York. And what you can immediately see by looking at this graph is that at the day of the event, you actually see a discrete jump in daily stocks, suggesting indeed that the announcement of the phase-out would positively capitalize in daily stocks return in the order of 7 to 8%. So when we look at the econometrics of this problem, the key empirical challenge, of course, in estimating the returns that happen as a result of this unexpected announcement, it has a very interesting challenge, which is the econometrician does not observe abnormal returns directly, and so the finance literature historically uses a market index as a proxy for what otherwise would have been the expected returns. And so in a very simple specification, you can imagine that the basic regression of an event study would be you have the event day and you are interested in measuring how returns change in the day of the event after controlling for the expected returns. So what we are going to do is we're going to estimate traditional finance models, and then we're going to contrast those against models where we recast this problem as a prediction problem and create a synthetic control by drawing from a pool of peer oil firms from around the world, and then do a variety of other data-driven methods. Now, here are the econometric results. And just to get us started, I first want to show you a naive model using the data from New York, where effectively you force the expected returns to be zero. Now, this would be, of course, in a world where on the day of the event there would have been no observed factors that otherwise would have altered the valuation of the stocks. And what you can see is that the appreciation of the announcement would translate in roughly a 6.7% appreciation in stocks. Now, it's very interesting that whether you estimate traditional finance models or you construct more sophisticated synthetic control or elastic nets, which would be a combination of machine learning and ridge regressions, on average, you actually see that the coefficients are actually surprisingly indistinguishable from one another when you use the New York data. Now, this is not to say that in general, data-driven models are still not preferred because, for example, a priori, the econometrician does not know whether there could actually have been any unobservables that the market index would have not captured well, or it could actually be the case that Petrobras, in the context of Brazil, is such a large firm that would actually bias your estimates because it would alter, it would have too much weight in the market index. And in fact, when you run the Brazilian model, in contrast with the data from New York, what you see is precisely that, which is when you use a synthetic control or the elastic net, the coefficients are similar, which they should be because the stock value should indeed clear the same way in both markets. But when you contrast the finance models, you see a downward bias suggesting that the finance models, the traditional finance models, at a minimum would have trouble handling this endogeneity. And so what we are going to do now is we're going to take this sufficient statistic that basically says that if we were to remove the price freeze, you would have roughly an appreciation in firm value of 7.5, around 7.5, 7.9%, and interpreted the same way as if you were to keep the policy, you would have a depreciation of roughly the same value. By the way, when we run the model for the second event, that's exactly what we find. We're going to take that sufficient statistic and measure the welfare effects of this policy. Now, to think about the welfare effects, consider the following. The gross cost of this policy is nothing but the cost to Petrobras of this transfer. The cost to Petrobras, which was the estimate that we just get, net of the transfer that you would give to individuals, which would basically be the size of the gasoline market, times the realized tax or subsidy that the price freeze guarantees. So one way to think about the welfare effects is really to separate the affected markets, starting with the fuel market, where consider a marginal increase in the price freeze, while the welfare effect would simply be the Harberger triangle here that would result from an increase in gasoline consumption times the wedge of the realized freeze against the domestic price. Now, interestingly, you need to think about how the price freeze is being funded. Now, if there were no uncertainty in international oil prices, you could imagine that the cost of the price freeze would simply be the traditional capital cost of funding the subsidy. Now, the problem is that in this case, because you are funding this subsidy by imposing a cost on an oil firm, shareholders and investors have to form expectations about what the actual subsidy may be. And so ex ante, given the trend on international oil prices that was going up, they may actually overestimate the cost that you are putting on Petrobras. And we're going to call that the cost of volatility, right? And so the revenue raising effect and this is actually going to be the source of the inefficiency of the policy, comes precisely because in addition to the traditional cost of capital, you actually have an extra cost, which is the cost that comes because you are financing this in a very strange way by effectively asking an oil company to bear the burden of the uncertainty in oil prices. So, when we take these... 2 minutes. Yeah, 2 minutes, that's perfect. When we look at the welfare costs, what we find is that this revenue raising indeed dominates the welfare cost, and this is because the implied capital cost to fund this price freeze is orders of magnitude much, much higher than what you would expect from a standard capital cost for an oil company like Petrobras. And in fact, this is in part because investors, by looking at projected oil prices, add an expected implied extended subsidy that was substantially higher than the actual subsidy that was realized, right? And so this leads me to then show you, and we do that in the paper, that it would have been possible to construct a lot of other instruments, for example, a price subsidy where you would move the uncertainty on oil price to consumers, or you could do target freezes, or you could actually do targeted insurance. And the point is that all these policies, in principle, could make lower-income individuals indifferent because, on average, they would transfer the exact same money, and to higher-income individuals, they would also be preferred, in part because higher-income individuals perhaps are not realizing that with the price freeze, they are having massive losses through their stocks in Petrobras. So what Petrobras is basically doing is doing a tax on higher income individuals to fund redistribution to the poor. Now, you could reduce this substantially if you were to either just do a targeted freeze or actually say to lower income individuals, I'm going to give you a credit card, and when you go put fuel in your tank, what I will pay for is the difference between what you see at the pump and some dock number that would probably be the maximum volatility that I could potentially see. And so what this would do would be remove the uncertainty to investors. Now, when we look at the data on political acceptability and how Dilma creates a collision of winning voters to win the election, what we could see is that in all instances, if all agents were actually rational, it would have been the case that you could reduce the cost of the policy quite a bit, and other than through the price subsidy, because the price subsidy would transfer the volatility to consumers, and if they have credit constraints, this could cause substantial welfare losses. If you were to do targeted price freezes or target insurance, you could potentially still win the election. And so it really begs the question, why are you not doing the policy reform? And I think when you look at both the distributional impact table, the cost table, and the voting table, perhaps this is suggestive evidence that either you are using an implied tax to sustain a freeze that goes unnoticed, and this is actually quite possible because many of the investors basically, or many of the shareholders, these shares are part, for example, of their pension plans, and so they may not actually have the salience that they are losing on these shares. Or perhaps if you were to open a discussion that you would want to move toward these policies, for you to open that discussion, you actually would have to open a full discussion on redistribution. And so, to the extent that economic agents at the higher income level may have a distaste for redistribution, all of a sudden they may actually oppose the reform. And so this would be suggestive of a behavioral failure where economic agents are actually overestimating the cost of alternative instruments when in fact they could have potentially been made better off. So that's basically what I want to show you. And I think this is quite important because what it suggests is that you know, when we look at international institutions saying, please remove energy subsidies, I think it is very easy to say remove energy subsidies to advance climate policy. But if these energy subsidies have this aspect of persistence, and in fact, in the context of fuel markets are done in this very subtle way, they are likely to persist. And they are likely to persist because no candidate, independent of political orientation, would have the incentive to remove them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Antonio. So.
Thank you. Pedro from Economics for Energy. I always wonder when I look at this analysis, and I don't know if you were able to do this, as you say, saliency is really important. So I always wonder why politicians do not apply this type of efficient policies at the right time. So my question is about timing. So, of course, this movement could make a politician lose an election. So the question is, why don't they apply these efficient policies just when they come into office so that voters will forget about it when it comes to the election? Have you been able to analyze this to some extent?
I have not been able to analyze that yet, in part because we are, from an econometrics point of view, the way to build a sufficient statistic is actually by taking advantage of this announcement, right? And this announcement, in a lot of respects, is kind of related to what you're saying. This announcement comes at the time where the board were almost certain that Dilma was a lame duck, and that she was actually losing a lot of control, not only of Petrobras, but a lot of other things in Brazil. And so they attempted to stab her on the back, and that she quickly demonstrated that that was not as easy by pushing them down. Now, when they made the second announcement, I think what they were thinking is exactly what you are saying, which is the second announcement basically says, we will reconsider this issue 15 months from now, which would be exactly after the election. But the problem is, after the election, and I think this is where the persistent theory of Acemoglu and the inertia of institutions holds, is that after the elections, you actually spend a lot of your political capital building the coalition to govern, and all you want to do is to show wins, and therefore it's highly quite unlikely that this would happen as a reform. Now, it is interesting that this will persist whether the candidate is from the left or from the right. And I have quotes in the paper that actually suggest that when Bolsonaro was running, can you believe that he went on a tic-for-tac with Lula, competing on who would keep the price freeze higher? And this actually makes a lot of sense, because the same way Dilma would lose the election if she would make this an issue of redistribution, if Bolsonaro were to say, if I come into power, I will remove these, he would basically lose the little support he has on the 3 lowest income groups, which, by the way, are the majority of the people, right? And so it's kind of interesting that Bolsonaro tried to do several reforms, but this was one of the sectors that he certainly didn't touch. So the idea that you're going to do reforms right after you get elected, I think it's very hard to study econometrically, because you actually want an exogenous announcement. But from what we have been seeing, country after country, it's just not going to happen.
Well, I think we don't have much time, but we don't need to go to Brazil to see these things. For instance, in the EU, after the Ukrainian invasion, we saw really inefficient policies in place, and with some of the, I mean, we had some study with José María Labandeira on these issues and how distributional issues are really behind, but at the same time, you know, the politicians are not getting the right answer. So thank you very much, Antonio, and we go for the last presentation. So you know Sato. She's research professor fellow at the Glachant Research Institute, London School of Economics. Thank you, Ms. Sato, for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Xavier, for the invite. I'm really pleased to have made it for the last AWE workshop. It's really real pleasure to be with you all. Okay, so this is joint work with colleagues at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE, Liane Cass and Aurélien Saucé. So we're examining support for residential rooftop solar PV. So you all know that solar, and to a lesser extent wind, is expected to play a major role in meeting climate goals. These are IEA projections of global installed capacity for electricity generation. So solar is expected to grow really rapidly over the next 2-3 decades, overtaking conventional technologies in just a few years. Solar has received more support than any other renewable technologies in Europe. In 2020, it was around 30 billion euros, and most of that was through feed-in tariffs, the blue component on the left chart there, but it also received other types of support like tradable quotas, tax allowances, loans, grants, RD&D. So at the same time, costs have been falling drastically as technology improves. This is the mean total cost of a very small system in the UK. So something like a 3 to 4 kilowatt capacity system is expected to become competitive by 2027. Large systems have already been competitive for some years. So this raises the question, do we still need to support solar going forward? And if so, to what degree and with what types of policies? So there's already a very rich literature on this topic. In the US and EU context, support for PV has been shown to increase adoption. The two main challenges found are cost effectiveness, due in part to poor targeting for rebates and high discount rates for feed-in tariff type policies. And another challenge is regressivity. So these policies tend to benefit the richer households. And also the literature is highlighting, these trade-offs and how to navigate or minimize these trade-offs whilst maximizing co-benefits. This is a kind of broader policy evaluation literature is, moving into this discourse of trade-offs. So what we do in this paper, so we are evaluating a recent PV support policy in Scotland, the Home Energy Scotland loan. So, one novelty here is that we're looking at a loan. Previous studies tend to be, studying grants or feed-in tariff schemes. So this, so we're looking at several outcomes: impact on adoption, distributional impacts across income deciles, and also the cost effectiveness of these policies. And we're trying to kind of feed into this discussion around the trade-offs between different outcomes and policy goals. So econometrically, we are using a matching diff and diff type approach, exploiting the fact that this policy was applied only in Scotland and not in England. And we're doing this at a very detailed level using micro-administrative data. So just briefly on background, so for our study period, 2010 to 2021, the main policy supporting solar in the UK was the feed-in tariff, a UK-wide policy. This ran for around 10 years, and basically the payment drastically reduced over the 2010s in line with technology costs. And so the policy we're examining, the HES loan, was introduced in 2017 when the feed-in tariff had largely collapsed. And here we're showing kind of estimated payback period in 3 parts of the UK with and without feed-in revenues. So the top lines are without feed-in tariff. So yeah, without it, because of the installation costs coming down, in the sunny part of the UK, PV payback period was already 20. I know it was already below 20 years, the payback period, by 2015. While in the north, it still stayed above a 20-year payback period. And with the FIT revenues, you can see that the payback period was increasing over time because the FIT tariff was coming down, but still, it was profitable enough by the end of the study period. So the Scottish policy, the Home Energy Scotland loan, it was an interest-free loan provided for energy efficiency upgrades and microgeneration, including PV. The maximum loan amount increased over time up to £6,000. And so it was the first time eligibility was expanded to all homeowners and not restricted to low-income households or the fuel-poor households. Okay, so quickly on the data. So we collected installation level data from MCS, Microgeneration Certification Scheme. So this is a certification body in the UK renewable energy sector which sets and maintains standards. So in order to be eligible for any government support, you have to have an MCS certified product and an installer. So the database is quite comprehensive. It covers most microgeneration installations in the UK, except maybe for new builds. And of the 1.5 million installations we have, about 84% of them are for domestic PV solar. So this is really rich data. It contains information about the exact product, exact installer, postcode, and for about half of the observations, we also have total cost of installation. We also collected data on the key drivers for PV adoption, which is solar generation potential, population density, green preferences, which we measure by Green Party votes in the European Parliament election in the pre-sample period. And also we use house prices to proxy for household income level, which I'll come back to. Okay, the map basically showed you the that there is solar potential in Scotland, believe it or not. And importantly, it's not that different from the north of England. Okay. And also the solar adoption in the UK is not that correlated with solar potential. Okay, so our strategy is to use matching with diff and diff. So like I said, we're exploiting this devolved nature of PV support in the UK and matching English and Scottish districts before and after the HES loan was introduced in 2017. And we're matching at the local authority district level. There are 32 in Scotland, 383 altogether in the UK. And we're matching on observable key characteristics in the pre-sample period, which is PV production, household income, population density, and green preferences. And our preferred matching strategy is cardinality matching. So why matching? Well, we think England is actually quite a good control. We prefer it to something like synthetic control. You can see there's a fair amount of overlap in the key characteristics. Less on the solar PV potential, but even then there's sufficient overlap. Okay, so with the cardinality matching, we end up with 32 matched LADs, 16 in England and 16 in Scotland. So we're matching about half of Scotland, but that's more than half of Scottish PV installations. You can see it's mostly kind of in the south of Scotland where we can find a good match. Okay, and it's a very standard diff and diff specification. I'll show here, standard errors at the LAD level. So right, results, finally. I'm already over time, so let me run quickly. So we find a statistically significant effect of the HES loan on household PV adoption. it's about 1 or 2 additional installations per 1,000 inhabitants following the HES loan, and this event study results show you that the impact increased over time as the maximum loan amount increased. You can also see that the pre-trends are fairly good. So we tested this with lots of other methods, like a regression discontinuity around the border, and we also tried some more new diff methods, and we find very similar results all across. An interesting finding is that the installation size seemed to have reduced. So this decline was quite notable. So basically there was a dramatic shift in Scotland towards very small and cheaper PV systems following the HES loan. When we split the sample into very small systems under 1,700 kilowatt hour of estimated annual generation, most of the effect was felt was found at the very small end of the size distribution. Why is that? We're still kind of looking at various hypotheses, but one, we see that basically the cost differentials between small and medium installations really, the gap narrowed by about 2017. We're not really sure why. And another hypothesis is that this combination of the HES loan and the declining feed-in tariff also changed this relative profitability. Basically, FIT loan is linked to generation capacity, so that really benefited large systems. But with the decline in that, it made small PV systems look not too bad. Or it could be that this policy led to installations in urban smaller roofs, or it targeted lower income households because it was a loan to address credit constraints. Anyway, we haven't got to the bottom of this yet. But overall, we can see here the red is England, the blue is Scotland. Basically, the HES loan managed to kind of recover some of the fall in installation that happened due to the fall in the FIT scheme. So while English installations completely collapsed, the Scottish installations came back up again. So we estimate around a 16 gigawatt of additional annual generation capacity due to this loan. So distributionally, who benefited? So one challenge here was that we don't have very detailed household income level for England. We do for Scotland. So we're using property value, which is available at the disaggregated LSOA level, and we show that it's a good proxy for household income. So the analysis, it's at the LSOA level, but it's still quite disaggregated. And we find basically that the loan was not regressive. The biggest beneficiaries were actually the lowest income decile. The effect was twice as large as the middle income deciles, and the difference is statistically significant. So this finding is in contrast with the literature, which finds that rebates and FIT schemes really tended to benefit the higher income households. And when we look at the unconditional distribution of installation per LSOA, the blue is Scotland, you can still see that the impact was focused on the two extremes. So lower income households installations went up, and the higher ones too. But basically in England, the higher income deciles also went up. They continued to go up, whereas the lower income deciles, the English installations went down. So the relative impact was stronger for the lower income deciles. Okay, so we're also trying to assess the cost effectiveness of these schemes. So we know that the Scottish government spent about 60 million over the 5-year period on these HES loans from a Freedom of Information request. And then we basically, used some assumptions and estimated the total installation costs of this additional generation capacity due to the HES loan, and we came up with around 54 million, which is not too bad. It's not too different from the 60 million that was actually spent, suggesting that maybe the inframarginal adoptions it wasn't such a big problem here. And we also compared it with some counterfactual cost estimates. And here we're looking at the marginal CO2 abatement costs. The red bars are for the HES loan. And the blue one is a counterfactual grant, a full grant. And so the left scenario is if the carbon intensity of the grid stayed the same, whereas the right one is if we went down to net zero. And so basically the marginal cost estimates range between 53 and 146. It was, I'm going to next compare it to some other estimates, but obviously a grant would have cost a lot more. It would have been hard to justify even like a 50% a grant. So our estimates are kind of in line with existing estimates in the literature, which range from $100 to about $300 per ton of CO2. And we were really surprised actually that a loan in Scotland could achieve similar to a grant in sunny California, and it shows that a loan could be a very cost-effective way to increase household solar adoption, even in northern latitudes. So our conclusion so far is installation of PV can be increased with a grant, even where the sun doesn't shine much. And this loan was found not to be regressive, and the costs appeared fairly reasonable, in line with offshore wind prices, current offshore wind prices in the UK. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Ms. Sato, and apologies for the technical trouble. Yeah. We have a couple of minutes for questions or comments to Ms. Sato. I think very interesting results in a way. Some of them unexpected.
Super interesting. May I just ask, did you see an increase in, or did you look at other consumption choices like purchase of cars or something? Because it's a free loan. You might think of that it kind of spills over to other decisions that households might make.
So the loan is fixed to your...
I understand. It's fixed. You need to do it, but it could still have an impact on other... It would be a sort of...
a kind of spillover effects on other things. Yeah, no, we haven't done that yet. We could look at other energy efficiency or microgeneration investments, but the sample size is much smaller, so the statistical power is less.
Thank you for the talk. When you were calculating the costs, are those purely the administrative costs? Is there a welfare cost in there? Is there a value of marginal cost of public funds in there?
In here.
How are you calculating these costs?
There's a bunch of assumptions that go in. It's not welfare costs. It's wait. I can't show you. Maybe I could give you the in-depth assumptions.
But I should think about it as administrative costs then, program costs.
For hold on. For this, yes, yes. Yeah, this is kind of assuming. This is the cost of all installations in Scotland, assuming the same effect for non-treated LADs, and it's administrative costs.